The spreadsheet on David's laptop screen made my blood turn to ice. Column after column of calculations, life insurance payouts, survivor benefits, and something that made my stomach drop to the floor. Lisa, projected death age, 35-40, probability. Factors, financial gain analysis. My husband of 8 years hadn't just been planning my funeral. He'd been calculating how much money he'd make from it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen in our home office doorway, groceries still, clutched in my hands, watching my world collapse in real time. The screensaver hadn't kicked in yet, and there it was, in black and white. My life reduced to dollar signs and actuarial tables. David was at his Thursday night poker game, the same routine he'd followed for months, giving me just enough time to discover what he thought would remain his secret forever. But here's the thing about secrets. Sometimes the person you're hiding them from has a few of their own. The morning everything changed started like any other Thursday in our quiet Riverside neighborhood. I'd kissed David goodbye as he headed to Thompson Insurance Group, the family business where he'd worked since college, and driven to my own job at Martinez Accounting downtown. Nothing felt different. The sun still painted golden streaks across our kitchen table. The coffee still tasted the same, and David still gave me that distracted peck on the cheek that had replaced real kisses somewhere along the way. I should have paid attention to the details that morning. How David's eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said he'd be late again. How he checked his phone 3 times during our brief breakfast conversation. How he mentioned, almost casually, that he'd updated our life insurance policies the week before. Just routine stuff. Nothing for me to worry about. Those words would echo in my mind for hours after I found that spreadsheet. The discovery itself happened by accident, which makes it even more chilling. I'd come home early from work with a splitting headache, planning to grab some files from David's home office and finish my client reports from bed. His laptop was open on the desk, something he normally never left unattended. David was meticulous about closing everything, logging out, shutting down. But there it sat, humming quietly, screen bright with something that would shatter my understanding of the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years. At first, I thought I was misreading the spreadsheet. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The columns were labeled with clinical precision: current life insurance value, accidental death benefit, survivor's social security, property transfer upon death, total net gain. But it was the rouse that made me sink into his desk chair, legs suddenly unable to support my weight. Each row represented a different scenario for my death. Row 1, natural causes, age 35. Row 2, accident, age 32. Row 3, illness, age 38. Each scenario meticulously calculated down to the penny, factoring in David's age at the time, his projected income, the house we'd bought together, even my small inheritance from my grandparents that he'd somehow included in his morbid mathematics. The most disturbing part wasn't just the numbers. It was the notes section, where he'd written things like optimal timing for remarriage and career advancement opportunities as widower. I scrolled through page after page of calculations, each one more detailed than the last. He'd researched widow benefits for federal employees since he worked for the county insurance board. He'd calculated how much sympathy might translate into business opportunities. He'd even factored in the cost of funeral arrangements, noting that a modest service would be most cost-effective for maximum community support. The dates on the files told their own story. The earliest versions went back 6 months, coinciding with when David had started working late more frequently, when he'd begun suggesting I take up new hobbies like hiking alone or driving long distances to visit friends. Activities that, I now realized with growing horror, carried higher risks of accidents. My hands shook as I continued reading. There were notes about increasing my life insurance coverage, which he'd handled entirely himself, telling me it was just smart financial planning. Notes about my family medical history, which he'd been unusually interested in lately, asking detailed questions about my grandmother's heart condition and my mother's diabetes. Notes about my daily routines, my medications, even my tendency to skip meals when stressed at work. The clinical detachment in his writing was perhaps the most frightening aspect of all. This wasn't the passionate planning of someone consumed by murderous rage. This was the methodical preparation of someone who saw me as a business opportunity, a commodity to be leveraged at the right moment for maximum profit. I wasn't his wife in these documents. I was Lisa Thompson, asset number 1, with a projected liquidation timeline. I found myself searching through his browser history, something I'd never done in 8 years of marriage. The sites he'd visited painted an even darker picture. Forums about accidental deaths and their frequency. Articles about suspicious circumstances that trigger insurance investigations. Research into various medical conditions that could cause sudden death in otherwise healthy women. He'd been thorough in his research, careful to understand not just the financial benefits, but also how to avoid suspicion. The most chilling discovery came in a folder labeled Contingency Planning. Inside were documents I recognized as our will, which David had insisted on updating just last month. But there were also papers I'd never seen before. A life insurance policy on me that I hadn't known existed, with a payout that made my eyes widen. Forms for Social Security survivor benefits that had already been filled out, waiting only for a death certificate. Even a preliminary contact list for funeral arrangements, with vendors David had apparently already spoken to about costs and services. But it was the timeline that made everything click into place. According to his notes, the optimal window for my unfortunate demise was the next 6 months. After that, his calculations showed, the financial benefits would begin to diminish due to his advancing age and changing insurance factors. There was even a specific date circled in red on a calendar printout, our upcoming 8th wedding anniversary, just 5 weeks away. As I sat in that office, surrounded by evidence of my husband's cold calculation of my death's value, I felt something inside me shift. The shock was still there, the hurt and betrayal cutting deep. But underneath those feelings, something harder was forming. David had made a critical error in his planning. He'd calculated everything about my death, but nothing about my life. He'd underestimated the woman he thought he knew so well. I thought about our 8 years together, searching for signs I'd missed. The way he'd become increasingly controlling. About our finances, insisting he handle all the insurance and investment decisions. How he'd encouraged me to quit my job twice, suggesting we could live comfortably on his income alone, though I'd refused both times. His sudden interest in my health, pushing me to see doctors more frequently, almost as if he was building a medical paper trail. The poker game started making sense, too. Every Thursday night for the past 4 months, David claimed to play cards with colleagues from work. But I'd never met these colleagues, never been invited to any work social events. When I'd suggested joining him sometime, he'd laughed it off, saying it was just a boring guys' night that would put me to sleep. Now I wondered if those Thursday nights were spent planning rather than playing, strategizing about timelines and opportunities. I forced myself to keep reading, to understand the full scope of what David had planned. There were notes about my daily routine, my usual routes to work, the times I typically arrived home. He'd documented my exercise habits, my weekend activities, even my monthly girls' night with my friend Rebecca. Everything had been cataloged with the attention to detail of someone planning a military operation. The financial projections were staggering. Between life insurance, Social Security benefits, the house, my retirement accounts, and various other assets, David stood to gain nearly $1 million from my death. But more than that, the notes revealed his long-term planning. He'd calculated how this windfall would allow him to expand the family insurance business potentially buying out his brother Ryan's share. There were even preliminary notes about which of my friends might be appropriate dating prospects after a respectful mourning period. I found myself thinking about recent conversations differently. David's sudden concern about my stress levels at work, his suggestions that I take more risks, try new adventures, his encouragement when I'd mentioned wanting to learn rock climbing, even offering to pay for lessons, his insistence that I drive alone to visit my college roommate 3 states away, a trip he'd normally want to take together. Every suggestion now seemed loaded with sinister possibility. The most devastating part wasn't just the betrayal, it was the realization that I'd been living with a stranger. The man I'd thought I knew, the one I'd planned to grow old with, start a family with, build a life alongside, didn't exist. In his place was someone who saw me as a financial instrument, a problem to be solved, an asset to be liquidated when the timing was optimal. But as I sat there in the growing darkness of our home office, David's laptop screen casting an eerie glow across spreadsheets full of my calculated demise, I realized something David hadn't factored into his equations. He'd spent months planning my death, but he had no idea what I was capable of in life. He'd calculated my value as a deceased wife, but completely miscalculated my worth as a living, breathing, thinking woman who now knew exactly what he was planning. I quietly closed the laptop, leaving everything exactly as I'd found it. David's poker game wouldn't end for hours, giving me time to process what I'd discovered and decide on my next steps. But one thing was already crystal clear in my mind. If David Thompson wanted to play games with life and death, with calculations and projections, then it was time he learned that he wasn't the only one in this marriage who knew how to plan ahead. As I walked through our house that evening, everything looked different. The family photos on the mantel, showing our wedding day and various anniversaries, now seemed like evidence in a case file. The insurance papers David kept so neatly organized in his desk, the investment portfolios he managed so carefully, even the beneficiary forms he'd insisted on updating regularly. It had all been preparation for a future where I no longer existed. But here's what David didn't know about his wife of 8 years. While he'd been calculating my death, I'd been building something of my own. Something he knew nothing about. Something that would change everything about his carefully laid plans. Because you see, the woman David married had evolved over our years together. The trusting, financially dependent young woman who'd said, "I do," had grown into someone much more formidable. And tomorrow, David Thompson was going to discover just how much his wife had changed while he'd been busy planning her funeral. The next morning, I watched David over breakfast with entirely new eyes. He buttered his toast with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else, including apparently planning my demise. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his Thompson Insurance polo shirt crisp and professional. To anyone watching, we looked like a normal married couple starting another ordinary Friday. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I could barely swallow my coffee, knowing that the man across from me had spent months calculating how much my death would be worth. David seemed unusually cheerful that morning, humming while he checked his phone and making small talk about weekend plans. He mentioned wanting to take a drive up to Pine Lake, just the two of us, maybe do some hiking on those remote trails we'd talked about. The casual suggestion made my skin crawl. Pine Lake was notorious for its steep cliffs and unpredictable weather. Cell phone service was spotty at best. 6 months ago, I would have thought it sounded romantic. Now it sounded like an opportunity. After David left for work, I called in sick to Martinez Accounting, claiming a stomach bug. My boss Sandra barely questioned it since I never took sick days and had been working overtime on the Henderson audit for weeks. The lie came easier than it should have, but then again, everything felt different now. I was no longer the trusting wife who took everything at face value. I was someone with a mission, and that mission was uncovering the full extent of my husband's planning. I started with our home office, but this time I knew what to look for. David had hidden his files well, buried in folders within folders on his laptop, but I'd always been good with computers. Better than he realized, apparently. While he thought I just used technology for basic accounting work, I'd actually taught myself quite a bit about digital forensics during slow periods at the office. Those skills came in handy now as I dug deeper into his digital life. The more I uncovered, the more systematic his approach became clear. David hadn't just been calculating financial benefits. He'd been researching everything from accidental death statistics to how insurance companies investigate suspicious claims. He'd joined online forums where people discussed true crime cases, specifically focusing on deaths that had initially appeared accidental but later proved to be murder. He'd studied them like case studies, learning what mistakes had led to discovery and conviction. One folder contained photographs he'd taken of me without my knowledge, pictures of me leaving for work, arriving home, meeting friends for lunch. They were dated and time-stamped, creating a detailed record of my daily patterns. There were photos of my car, my usual parking spots, even the route I took during my evening jogs around the neighborhood. The clinical documentation of my life felt like being watched by a predator, which I suppose I had been. But the most disturbing discovery was a document titled Risk Assessment and Mitigation. David had actually categorized different methods of causing my death by their likelihood of success and probability of investigation. Vehicle accidents rated highly because they seemed random and were difficult to prove intentional. Falls during hiking or climbing ranked well because they appeared to be recreational mishaps. Even household accidents had been considered and ranked according to their feasibility. He'd researched the specific medications I took for my occasional migraines, noting that certain combinations could cause dangerous interactions if administered in higher doses. He'd looked into my food allergies, which were mild but could potentially be triggered more severely under the right circumstances. Every aspect of my health and habits had been weaponized in his mind, turned into potential tools for my destruction. The timeline was what made everything feel urgently real. According to his notes, David planned to initiate his final phase within the next month. Our 8th anniversary was marked as the ideal target date, with notations about how a tragic accident, right around our anniversary, would generate maximum sympathy and minimum suspicion. He'd even drafted the beginnings of a eulogy, describing me as his devoted wife who'd tragically died just as we were planning to start a family. That particular detail made me physically sick. We'd been trying to get pregnant for over a year, something David claimed to want as much as I did. Now I realized he'd been using our attempts at conception as part of his cover story while simultaneously planning to end my life before I could actually conceive. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I needed to understand how long this had been going on, so I started checking older files, email histories, even his web browsing from months past. The trail led back much further than I'd initially realized. The earliest traces dated back almost 2 years, starting with seemingly innocent research into life insurance policies and gradually evolving into something far more sinister. This hadn't been a recent decision born from marital problems or financial stress. This had been a long-term strategy, carefully developed and refined over time. David's email correspondence revealed another layer of deception. He'd been in touch with his brother Ryan about potential changes to the family business structure. Ryan owned 40% of Thompson Insurance Group, with David holding 30% and their parents Frank and Carol maintaining 30% control. But in emails from 6 months ago, David had discussed with Ryan the possibility of buying out their parents' share to expand the business significantly. The funding for such a purchase would require substantial capital, exactly the kind of money that would come from life insurance payouts and survivor benefits. The pieces were falling into place in the most horrifying way possible. This wasn't just about David wanting me dead for financial gain. It was about him using my death as startup capital for his business ambitions. I wasn't just a victim in his plan. I was an investment he intended to liquidate to fund his professional goals. I spent hours that day going through every document, every email, every search history entry I could access. David had been meticulous in his planning, but he'd also been arrogant. He'd never considered that I might discover his preparations, so he'd left trails everywhere once I knew where to look. His computer was full of evidence that would be devastating in the wrong hands, or in this case, the right ones. But I needed more than just digital evidence. I needed to understand the practical aspects of his planning. Had he already taken concrete steps beyond research and calculation? Were there other people involved? Was his family aware of his intentions? The questions multiplied as quickly as the evidence, and I realized that uncovering the truth was going to require more than just searching through his laptop. That afternoon, I drove to Thompson Insurance Group under the pretense of surprising David with lunch. The office was a modest building on Riverside's main commercial strip, sandwiched between a real estate agency and a small law firm. I'd been there dozens of times over the years for company events and family gatherings, but this time I was looking at everything with investigative eyes. David wasn't in when I arrived, which his assistant Kelly explained by saying he was out meeting with clients all afternoon. But Kelly was chatty as always, and I'd learned over the years that she loved to gossip about office dynamics. I mentioned casually that David had seemed stressed lately, working so many extra hours, and Kelly's expression immediately grew concerned. "He's been putting in crazy time recently," she agreed, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Lots of meetings with lawyers and financial advisors that he usually handles during regular hours. Plus all those evening appointments with new clients." Kelly paused, then added something that made my stomach clench. "Your husband's been asking a lot of questions about claims processing lately, specifically about how long investigations take and what triggers closer examination by the insurance companies." I managed to keep my expression neutral while Kelly continued talking, but inside I was screaming. David wasn't just planning my death. He was researching how to ensure the insurance claims would be processed quickly and without suspicion. He was using his professional knowledge and connections to create the perfect conditions for collecting on my life insurance policies. Kelly mentioned that David had been working closely with Patricia Williams, a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and insurance claims. He'd referred several new clients to her recently, all of them young couples looking to update their life insurance coverage. The coincidence felt anything but coincidental. Was David using other couples to establish a pattern of normal insurance, planning that would make his own claims appear routine? I left the office with more questions than answers, but also with a growing understanding of how extensive David's preparations had become. This wasn't the impulsive plan of someone who'd recently decided to kill his wife. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme that had been in development for years, involving professional connections and systematic preparation that went far beyond anything I'd initially imagined. That evening, I sat in our living room watching David prepare dinner, the domestic scene surreal given what I now knew. He was making my favorite pasta dish, being unusually attentive and affectionate. He asked about my day, listened to my fabricated story about recovering from my stomach bug, even suggested we watch a movie together afterward. The performance was flawless, which made it even more chilling. During dinner, David brought up the Pine Lake trip again, this time with more specific details. He'd already researched the hiking trails, identified the most scenic overlooks, even checked the weather forecast for the weekend. He painted a picture of romantic isolation, just the two of us connecting with nature and each other. Every word he spoke sounded reasonable and loving, but I heard the planning underneath it all. I heard the man who'd spent months figuring out how to kill me, discussing the location where he intended to do it. I agreed to the trip, keeping my voice light and enthusiastic. David's smile was genuinely pleased, which disturbed me more than any amount of obvious deception would have. He was happy because he thought his plan was working, because he believed I was walking blindly toward my own destruction. What he didn't realize was that agreeing to Pine Lake gave me something too, a timeline and a location. I now knew when and where David intended to strike. After dinner, while David watched television, I retreated to our bedroom and began planning my own strategy. If David thought he was the only one in this marriage capable of deception and long-term thinking, he was about to learn otherwise. I pulled out my laptop and started researching everything I could about protecting myself legally and financially from a spouse who intended harm. But first, I needed allies. I needed people who could help me gather evidence, protect my assets, and ensure that if something happened to me, the truth would come to light. David had spent 2 years preparing for my death, but I had something he didn't. I was still alive, still thinking, still capable of fighting back. And unlike my husband, I didn't need to plan anyone's murder to secure my future. I just needed to plan my escape from someone who did. The next morning, I made the first call that would change everything. Patricia Williams' law office was located in a sleek building downtown, just 10 minutes from my own workplace. When I called requesting an appointment, I mentioned that I needed to discuss estate planning and asset protection in a potentially volatile marriage situation. Her secretary scheduled me for Monday afternoon, giving me the weekend to prepare my approach. But before I could build a case, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with financially. David had always handled our major investments and insurance decisions, claiming it was more efficient since he worked in the industry. I'd trusted his expertise and been grateful not to deal with the paperwork. Now I realized that trust had been weaponized against me, leaving me vulnerable and uninformed about my own financial situation. I spent Saturday morning calling every insurance company David had mentioned over the years, claiming I needed policy information for tax preparation purposes. The picture that emerged was staggering. David had taken out multiple life insurance policies on me through different companies, a practice known as layering that's designed to maximize payouts while minimizing the chance that any single company would notice suspicious patterns. The total coverage was nearly $2 million, far more than what would be considered reasonable for someone with my income level. Each policy had been carefully structured to stay just below the thresholds that would trigger automatic investigation. But together, they represented a massive financial incentive for my death. David had used his industry connections to spread the coverage across different carriers, making it unlikely that any one company would realize the full scope of the coverage. But the most disturbing discovery came when I contacted our bank about our joint accounts. David had been systematically moving money over the past year, not just from our savings, but from investment accounts I didn't even know we had. He'd created a complex web of financial products that I couldn't access or monitor, effectively making himself the sole controller of our assets while maintaining the appearance of joint ownership. When I asked about recent account activity, the bank representative mentioned something that made my blood freeze. David had inquired about the process for transferring accounts in the event of a spouse's death, specifically asking about timeframes and documentation requirements. He'd even obtained the necessary forms in advance, ostensibly for estate planning purposes. Everything had been designed for rapid transfer of assets with minimal delays or complications. I realized that David's planning went far beyond just collecting insurance money. He'd structured our entire financial life to ensure that my death would result in immediate and complete control of all assets, with no legal complications or administrative delays. I wouldn't just be dead. I'd be erased financially as efficiently as possible. That afternoon, I drove to a different part of town and opened a new bank account under my maiden name, Lisa Martinez. I deposited the small amount of money I'd managed to keep in my personal checking account, along with a savings account David didn't know about that contained money from freelance accounting work I'd done over the years. It wasn't much, but it was a start toward financial independence. The process of opening the account required me to think about my identity in ways I hadn't considered for years. As Lisa Thompson, I was David's wife, a supporting character in his life and plans. As Lisa Martinez, I was someone with my own credit history, my own professional reputation, my own potential for independence. The bank employee processing my paperwork saw me as an individual, not half of a couple, and that perspective felt revolutionary after 8 years of merged identity. Sunday brought an unexpected opportunity when David announced he needed to go into the office to catch up on client files. He'd be gone most of the day, giving me freedom to investigate without watching over my shoulder. The moment his car pulled out of our driveway, I was back at his laptop, but this time I had a specific mission: copying everything I'd found onto a secure drive that I could take with me. The process took hours, but I methodically copied every folder, every document, every piece of evidence I'd discovered. David's digital planning for my death, his financial research, his correspondence about business expansion, his timeline for my murder. Everything went onto an encrypted drive that I could hide safely away from our home. If something happened to me before I could fully implement my own plans, at least there would be evidence of David's intentions. While copying files, I discovered something new that changed my understanding of the situation even further. David had been in communication with someone identified in his contacts only as MR. The messages were brief and cryptic, but they clearly related to surveillance and timing. MR had been providing David with information about my schedule, my routes, my habits, details that matched perfectly with the photographs I'd found of myself. The realization that David had enlisted someone to help monitor me was terrifying. This wasn't just a husband planning his wife's death. This was a conspiracy involving at least one other person. I scrolled through months of messages, trying to identify who MR might be and how long this surveillance had been going on. The messages suggested that MR was being paid for this information, making it a business arrangement rather than a favor between friends. One message thread particularly caught my attention. MR had provided detailed information about my evening jogging route, including the specific times I usually passed certain landmarks and the locations where street lighting was poorest. David had responded with questions about whether my route ever varied and what might cause me to change my usual timing. The clinical discussion of my vulnerability while jogging alone made me realize I'd been in danger far longer than I'd known. I made the decision to stop jogging entirely, at least until I could figure out how to protect myself. But more importantly, I realized I needed professional help to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. This had grown beyond a marriage problem into something that required legal and possibly law enforcement intervention. Monday morning, I called in sick to work again and drove to Patricia Williams's office. The lawyer was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was decorated with degrees and professional certifications that spoke to decades of experience in family law and estate planning. When I explained that I needed advice about protecting myself from a spouse who might wish me harm, she listened without judgment and took careful notes. Patricia's questions were direct and professional. Had I documented the threats? Did I have evidence of planning or intent? Was I in immediate physical danger? When I showed her the encrypted drive containing David's files, her expression grew increasingly serious. She'd handled contentious divorces before, but she told me frankly that the level of planning I'd uncovered was beyond anything she'd encountered in family law. The lawyer's advice was clear and urgent. First, I needed to secure my personal safety, which might require leaving our shared home sooner rather than later. Second, I needed to protect my assets immediately, before David realized I knew about his plans. Third, I needed to consider involving law enforcement, since what I'd discovered suggested premeditated attempted murder rather than just divorce-related financial misconduct. But Patricia also warned me about the challenges I'd face. David's evidence was all on his personal computer, which I'd accessed without permission. While the content was damning, the method of obtaining it could complicate any legal proceedings. We'd need to build a case that didn't rely solely on evidence that might be challenged in court. She recommended I hire a private investigator to document David's activities independently, creating a legal trail of evidence that could support what I'd discovered on his computer. She also suggested I contact Karen Foster, a financial advisor who specialized in protecting assets during high conflict. Divorces. The goal was to build a comprehensive strategy that would protect me physically, legally, and financially. I left Patricia's office with a list of actions to take and a timeline for implementing them. But I also left with something more valuable: the knowledge that I wasn't overreacting or being paranoid. A legal professional had confirmed that David's planning constituted a serious threat that required immediate and decisive action. That afternoon, I met with Karen Foster at her office in the financial district. Karen was younger than Patricia, but equally sharp, with an MBA from Berkeley and a reputation for protecting clients' assets in complex domestic situations. When I explained my circumstances, she immediately began outlining strategies for securing my financial independence while building a case for recovering assets David had hidden. Karen's approach was methodical and thorough. She helped me identify every account, every investment, every asset that David had moved or hidden over the past 2 years. Together, we created a comprehensive picture of our true financial situation, including money I hadn't known existed and accounts I couldn't access. The total value was significant, representing years of combined income and investment growth that David had been positioning to control entirely. But Karen also showed me something I hadn't expected. I had more financial power than I'd realized. My work at Martinez Accounting had given me a solid professional reputation and income stream that was entirely independent of David. My credit history was excellent, my employment was stable, and I had skills that were in high demand. While David had been planning to profit from my death, I could build a successful life without him entirely. The financial advisor helped me open additional accounts and begin transferring assets that were legitimately mine. We moved my personal retirement funds, my inheritance from my grandparents, and income from freelance work into accounts that David couldn't access or monitor. It wasn't enough to match what he'd hidden, but it was enough to give me independence and options. By the end of the week, I had assembled a team of professionals and begun implementing a comprehensive plan to protect myself. But I also realized that passive defense wasn't enough. David was actively planning to kill me within the next few weeks, and simply securing my assets wouldn't address the immediate physical threat I faced. I needed to do more than just protect myself. I needed to stop David's plan entirely, in a way that would expose his intentions and ensure he could never threaten me or anyone else again. The question was how to turn the tables on someone who thought he held all the advantages, without putting myself in greater danger in the process. The answer came to me as I sat in our living room that Friday evening, watching David research hiking trails for our upcoming Pine Lake trip. He was so confident in his planning, so certain that I was oblivious to his intentions. His arrogance was going to be his downfall, because while he'd spent 2 years planning my death, I was about to spend the next 2 weeks planning his complete destruction. But unlike David, I wouldn't need to hurt anyone to achieve my goals. I just needed to be smarter than the man who thought he'd married someone too trusting and naive to fight back. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Amy Rodriguez had been serving tables at Giovanni's Italian Bistro for 3 years, working her way through nursing school with evening shifts at the restaurant. I'd never paid much attention to her before, beyond the usual pleasantries when David and I dined there occasionally. But everything changed when she approached me in the parking lot after a particularly tense dinner with David's parents the previous Tuesday. "Lisa, right?" Amy had said, glancing around nervously. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but I've been wanting to talk to you for weeks. There's something you should know about your husband and the conversations I've been overhearing at work." What Amy told me that night in the restaurant parking lot confirmed my worst fears while providing an opportunity I hadn't expected. David had been meeting regularly at Giovanni's with someone Amy described as a scruffy man in his 40s who always paid in cash and never used credit cards. Their conversations, which Amy had overheard while serving nearby tables, involved Detailed discussions about my schedule, my habits, and what Amy described as timing for some kind of plan. The man Amy described matched perfectly with my suspicions about MR from David's text messages. But more importantly, Amy had been documenting these meetings on her own, taking note of dates and times because something about the conversations had made her uncomfortable. She'd even managed to discreetly photograph the mysterious man during one of their meetings, thinking she might need evidence if whatever they were planning turned out to be illegal. Amy's information provided the missing piece I needed: independent verification of David's conspiracy that didn't rely on evidence I'd obtained illegally from his computer. But Amy offered something even more valuable. She was willing to help me gather additional evidence, and her position at Giovanni's gave her access to continue monitoring David's activities without arousing suspicion. We met the following evening at a coffee shop across town, far from anywhere David might see us together. Amy explained that she'd grown up in an abusive household and had learned to recognize the signs of someone planning violence against a family member. David's behavior and conversations had triggered every alarm bell she'd developed over years of surviving domestic violence. What Amy proposed was brilliant in its simplicity. Giovanni's had recently installed a new security system with high-definition cameras and audio recording capabilities in the dining areas. As an employee, Amy had access to the system and could retrieve recordings of David's meetings with M.R. The restaurant kept footage for 30 days before automatically deleting it, giving us a limited window to capture evidence of their planning sessions. But Amy's most valuable contribution was information about David's timeline. According to conversations she'd overheard, David was accelerating his plans because he'd become concerned about something he called changing variables. Amy wasn't sure what that meant, but the urgency in his discussions suggested he planned to act much sooner than the anniversary date I'd found in his files. This revelation changed everything about my own timeline. If David was moving up his schedule, I needed to implement my countermeasures immediately rather than waiting for the perfect moment to spring my trap. The Pine Lake trip, which I'd thought was still 2 weeks away, was actually scheduled for the upcoming weekend. David had been lying about the date, giving me less time to prepare while ensuring I couldn't change my own plans to avoid the trip. Amy and I spent hours developing a strategy that would capture David's confession while ensuring my safety. The plan required careful timing and coordination, but it had the advantage of using David's own overconfidence against him. He was so certain that I was unaware of his intentions that he'd grown careless in his communications with MR, speaking openly in public places about details that would be damning if recorded. But I needed more than just evidence of conspiracy. I needed proof of David's specific intent to commit murder, recorded in his own voice with enough detail to ensure conviction. Amy suggested that the best opportunity would come during one of his meetings with MR, but only if we could manipulate the circumstances to get David talking about his complete plan. The manipulation came through something David would never suspect: his own ego. Amy would approach his table during his next meeting with MR, pretending to recognize MR as someone she'd gone to high school with. The interruption would fluster David and likely make him protective of his privacy, but Amy would persist just long enough to plant seeds of doubt about whether their conversations had been overheard by restaurant staff. David's reaction to this perceived security breach would force him to have a more detailed conversation with MR about their plans, timeline, and methods. People who think they've been compromised often overcompensate by discussing exactly the details they're worried might have been discovered. Amy would ensure that conversation happened in range of the restaurant's recording equipment, giving us audio evidence of David's murderous intentions in his own words. The plan required split-second timing and perfect execution, but it also offered something I desperately needed: definitive proof that would protect me regardless of what happened next. If David succeeded in killing me, the recordings would ensure he was prosecuted for murder. If I survived his attempt, the recordings would provide enough evidence to have him arrested before he could try again. But Amy's assistance came with something I hadn't expected: friendship. As we planned David's downfall together, I realized how isolated I'd become during my marriage. David had gradually separated me from friends and family, claiming he wanted us to focus on building our life together. I'd interpreted his behavior as romantic devotion rather than controlling manipulation, but Amy's outsider perspective helped me see the pattern clearly. Amy had noticed things about my relationship with David that I'd never recognized. How he interrupted me when I spoke to other people, how he answered questions directed at me, how he positioned himself physically to control my interactions with servers and staff when we dined out. She'd watched him systematically undermine my confidence and independence over the 3 years she'd known us as customers, recognizing the signs of emotional abuse even when I didn't. This realization added another dimension to my situation. David hadn't just been planning to kill me for financial gain. He'd been conditioning me for years to be the perfect victim. The isolation, the financial dependence, the gradual erosion of my self-confidence. It had all been preparation for ensuring I wouldn't fight back when he made his final move. But David had made a critical miscalculation. While he'd been busy shaping me into his ideal victim, I'd been growing stronger in ways he never noticed. My work at Martinez Accounting had given me financial skills and professional confidence. My secret savings account had provided a foundation for independence. My ability to uncover his digital planning had proven I was far more capable than he'd assumed. Amy helped me recognize that I'd been fighting back long before I consciously decided to oppose David's plans. Every dollar I'd saved secretly, every skill I'd developed independently, every moment I'd trusted my instincts over his explanations. It had all been preparation for this confrontation, even though I hadn't realized it at the time. The week leading up to David's meeting with MR at Giovanni's was the longest of my life. I had to maintain the pretense of normal married life while coordinating with Amy and putting final pieces of my legal protection in place. Patricia Williams had prepared divorce papers that could be filed immediately if necessary, while Karen Foster had secured my independent assets in accounts David couldn't access or freeze. But the most important preparation was psychological. I had to transform myself from someone who'd been conditioned to defer and accommodate into someone capable of confronting a man who wanted me dead. Amy helped with this transformation, sharing techniques she'd learned in therapy for recognizing manipulation and maintaining emotional clarity under pressure. The night before David's scheduled meeting with MR, I found myself looking in the bathroom mirror and seeing someone I barely recognized. The woman staring back at me had strength in her eyes that hadn't been there a month ago. She looked like someone who could handle whatever came next, someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated or manipulated. David, meanwhile, had no idea that his perfectly planned murder was about to become his own destruction. He continued his routine of affectionate husband preparing for a romantic weekend getaway, completely unaware that his wife had become someone entirely different from the person he thought he'd married. The next evening would determine everything. Either I'd finally have the evidence needed to stop David permanently, or I'd discover that his planning was even more extensive and dangerous than I'd realized. But regardless of what happened, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer the helpless victim David expected me to be. I was someone who fought back, and David Thompson was about to learn exactly what that meant. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Riverside beautiful in October. David was unusually nervous at dinner, checking his phone repeatedly and making small talk that felt forced even by our recent standards. He mentioned again that he had a client meeting after dinner. Nothing important, just some paperwork to review. I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the trusting wife while knowing that his client meeting was actually the conversation that would destroy him. Amy had confirmed that David's reservation at Giovanni's was for 8:30, with the same corner table he always requested for these mysterious meetings. The restaurant's new recording system was fully operational, and Amy had tested the audio quality from multiple angles to ensure perfect capture. Everything was in place for David to condemn himself with his own words. After David left for his meeting, I drove to a parking spot across the street from Giovanni's where I could observe the restaurant without being seen. Through the large front windows, I watched David arrive precisely on time and take his usual table. 5 minutes later, a man matching Amy's description of MR joined him, sliding into the booth with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done this many times before. My phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Everything's recording. We'll text when it's over." Sitting in my car watching my husband plan my murder was surreal beyond description. David looked relaxed and confident, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. To MR. From my distant vantage point, he appeared to be simply having a business dinner with a colleague. The normalcy of the scene made the reality even more chilling. 20 minutes into their meeting, I saw Amy approach their table with the casual confidence of a server checking on customers, but I knew she was actually implementing our plan, pretending to recognize MR and engaging in the brief conversation that would make David paranoid about security. Even from across the street, I could see David's body language change the moment. Amy started talking to MR. His relaxed posture became rigid, his gestures sharp and controlled. Amy lingered at their table just long enough to plant the seeds of doubt, then moved away with the professional efficiency of someone who'd done nothing more than provide good customer service. But the damage was done. David immediately leaned forward, his conversation with MR becoming intense and urgent. Whatever they were discussing now, it was exactly what we needed him to say on record. 45 minutes after David's meeting began, my phone buzzed again. "Got everything?" He said things that will put him away forever. I waited in the parking lot until David's meeting ended, and both men left the restaurant separately. David drove home while MR walked to a battered pickup truck that Amy had photographed earlier. I followed MR long enough to get his license, plate number, then headed home to continue my performance as the unsuspecting wife. David arrived 20 minutes after I did, claiming his client meeting had run longer than expected. He seemed agitated but tried to hide it, suggesting we watch a movie together to relax before our big weekend trip to Pine Lake. I agreed enthusiastically, discussing hiking plans and packing lists while internally preparing for the confrontation that would end our marriage and his freedom. Saturday morning brought the phone call that changed everything. Amy had spent the night reviewing the restaurant's audio recordings and transcribing the most damning portions of David's conversation with MR. What she'd captured was beyond my most optimistic expectations. David had indeed been rattled by Amy's approach to their table, worried that restaurant staff might have overheard previous conversations. In response, he'd outlined his entire plan to MR in explicit detail, including the specific method he intended to use to kill me at Pine Lake, the timeline for implementing his plan, and his strategy for ensuring the death appeared accidental. But the recording revealed something else that made my blood run cold. David hadn't just been planning to kill me that weekend. He'd been planning to kill me that very day, during what I thought was a romantic hike to Pine Lake. The weekend trip was a fiction designed to give him an alibi while MR carried out the actual murder using methods that would make my death appear to be the result of a hiking accident. According to the recording, MR was already at Pine Lake, preparing the location, and waiting for David to bring me to the predetermined spot. David planned to suggest we take separate cars to the trailhead, claiming he had work calls to make during the drive. Once there, he would delay our start time with various excuses while MR positioned himself along the trail. The actual murder would happen during what appeared to be a romantic hike, with David having the perfect alibi of being present but unable to prevent a tragic accident. The sophistication of the plan was terrifying, but it also provided exactly the evidence I needed. David hadn't just been researching my death or planning hypothetical scenarios. He had hired someone to commit murder, chosen a specific location, and set a timeline for execution. Everything was captured on high-quality audio recording that would be admissible in court. Amy met me at the coffee shop where we'd first planned our strategy. bringing copies of the recordings and a transcript she'd prepared overnight. Listening to my husband calmly discuss the logistics of my murder was the most surreal experience of my life. His voice was steady and businesslike as he described how MR should push me from a specific cliff overlook, how they should position my body to suggest an accidental fall, and how David should react when he discovered my body to generate maximum sympathy. But the recording also revealed David's arrogance and the extent of his underestimation of my capabilities. He spoke about me dismissively, describing me as trusting and naive, someone who would never suspect his intentions or fight back against his plans. He even joked with MR about how easy it had been to manipulate me over the years, how I'd accepted every explanation and excuse without question. That conversation was about to become the biggest mistake of David's life. I spent Saturday afternoon implementing the final phase of my own plan. Patricia Williams met me at her office despite the weekend, reviewing the recordings and confirming they provided sufficient evidence for both criminal charges and civil litigation. She contacted the police department's domestic violence unit, arranging for officers to be standing by for David's arrest. Karen Foster helped me complete the transfer of all accessible assets to my secure accounts, effectively freezing David out of our joint finances before he could realize what was happening. By the end of the day, I had legal, financial, and law enforcement support in place for the confrontation that would end David's plans permanently. But I wanted more than just David's arrest. I wanted him to understand that the woman he'd tried to murder was far more formidable than he'd ever imagined. I wanted him to experience the same shock and betrayal he'd planned to inflict on me. Most importantly, I wanted justice to be served in a way that would ensure he could never threaten anyone else the way he'd threatened me. Sunday morning, David woke up excited about our trip to Pine Lake. He'd packed his hiking gear the night before, laying out clothes and supplies with the methodical precision of someone preparing for an important mission, which, in his mind, he was. He hummed while making coffee, chatted enthusiastically about the weather forecast, and even suggested we stop for breakfast at that little diner we'd visited on our second anniversary. The performance was flawless, right down to his affectionate kiss goodbye when he said he'd meet me at the Pine Lake trailhead after making a few work calls from his car. I watched him drive away, knowing it would be the last time David Thompson would ever believe he had control over my life or death. While he headed toward what he thought would be my murder, I was driving to the Riverside Police Department to hand over evidence that would destroy him completely. Detective Maria Santos had been expecting me since Saturday afternoon when Patricia Williams first contacted the domestic violence unit. Detective Santos specialized in cases involving intimate partner violence and had seen enough attempted murders disguised as accidents to immediately understand the significance of what I'd uncovered. She listened to portions of the restaurant recording with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly how rare it was to capture this level of premeditation on audio. The detective's questions were thorough and professional. How long had I suspected David's intentions? Did I feel I was in immediate physical danger? Was I certain about the timeline for his planned attack? When I explained that David believed I was driving to Pine Lake at that very moment to meet my death, Detective Santos immediately contacted the sheriff's department that had jurisdiction over the lake area. Within 30 minutes, a coordinated response was in motion. Undercover officers were dispatched to Pine Lake to locate and arrest MR before he could harm any innocent hikers who might be mistaken for me. Detective Santos accompanied me to Giovanni's restaurant to officially collect the audio recordings and obtain Amy's witness statement. A warrant was prepared for David's arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, with additional charges pending based on what the investigation might uncover. But I wanted to be the one to tell David that his perfect plan had failed. Detective Santos initially resisted this request, citing safety concerns and standard procedure. However, when I explained that David would become suspicious if I simply disappeared without explanation, potentially fleeing before arrest, she agreed to a controlled confrontation at the police station with officers present for protection. The call to David was the most satisfying conversation of our 8-year marriage. I told him I'd had car trouble on the way to Pine Lake and was stuck at a mechanic's shop in town. Could he come get me? The concern in his voice was immediate and convincing. Of course he'd come right away. Poor Lisa, stranded and helpless, exactly as he'd always seen me. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes, that everything would be fine, that we could reschedule our romantic hike for another day. I gave him the address of the police station's parking lot, claiming it was where the mechanic's shop was located. David arrived exactly on time, pulling up to what he thought was a rescue mission for his stranded wife. Instead, he found me standing next to Detective Santos and 2 uniformed officers, very much alive and very much in control of the situation. The expression on David's face when he realized what was happening will stay with me forever. Confusion gave way to shock, then to a desperate calculation as he tried to understand how his perfect plan had unraveled. For just a moment, I saw fear in his eyes as he grasped that the helpless victim he'd been planning to murder had somehow become the architect of his downfall. Detective Santos read David his rights with professional efficiency while I watched. The man who'd planned my death get handcuffed in the same parking lot where he'd expected to comfort me after a mechanical breakdown. The irony was perfect. David had spent 2 years planning to manipulate me into a vulnerable position where he could control my fate. Instead, I'd manipulated him into the most vulnerable position possible, standing in a police station parking lot with overwhelming evidence of his murderous intentions. Before they put David in the patrol car, Detective Santos allowed me to speak to him directly. I wanted him to understand exactly how thoroughly he'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to kill. I started by telling him about the restaurant recordings, watching his face pale as he realized his conversation with MR had been captured in detail. Then I explained about the financial records I'd copied, the legal team I'd assembled, and the comprehensive strategy I'd developed to protect myself. But what I really wanted David to understand was how completely wrong he'd been about who I was. The trusting, naive wife he'd described to MR had never existed. I'd been documenting his suspicious behavior for months, questioning his explanations, and investigating his activities long before I found his murder planning files. The woman he thought he'd married was a fiction, a role I'd played because it made my life easier, not because it reflected my actual capabilities. I told David about the secret bank account I'd maintained throughout our marriage, funded by freelance, work he'd never known about. I explained how I'd been building professional relationships and financial independence while he'd assumed I was becoming more dependent on him. Most importantly, I wanted him to know that his death wasn't the only way to escape our marriage. I'd been planning my own exit strategy for over a year, just in case our relationship continued deteriorating. David's reaction to these revelations was almost worth the terror he'd put me through. The man who'd spent months calculating how to profit from my death was discovering that his intended victim had been 10 steps ahead of him the entire time. While he'd been researching accidental death statistics, I'd been researching divorce law. While he'd been planning my murder, I'd been planning my independence. The final revelation was the most devastating. I pulled out a folder containing documents David had never seen before, copies of life insurance policies I'd taken out on him over the past year. While he'd been layering coverage on my life, I'd been doing the same thing to his. The difference was that my policies were legitimate, financial protection for a wife who'd begun to suspect her husband might be dangerous. His policies were tools for profiting from murder. I watched David's face as he realized that if his plan had succeeded, if I'd actually died in a hiking accident at Pine Lake, the subsequent investigation would have uncovered his massive insurance coverage on my life. But it also would have revealed my insurance coverage on his life, raising questions about why both spouses had recently increased coverage on each other. His plan, which he'd thought was sophisticated and foolproof, would have immediately aroused suspicion and led to exactly the kind of investigation he'd tried to avoid. Detective Santos interrupted our conversation to inform me that officers at Pine Lake had successfully arrested MR without incident. He'd been found waiting near the cliff overlook David had specified in their recorded conversation, equipped with ropes and tools that would have been used to stage my accidental death. MR had immediately confessed to the conspiracy when confronted, with the audio evidence, providing additional details about David's planning and payment for the murder scheme. As the patrol car pulled away with David in the back seat, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the immediate threat was over, satisfaction that justice was being served, anger at the betrayal and manipulation I'd endured. But mostly, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete control over my own life and future. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. David's recorded confession to hiring a hitman provided prosecutors with an overwhelming case for attempted murder and conspiracy charges. MR's testimony about their planning sessions, and David's payments filled in any remaining gaps in the evidence. The financial records I'd gathered demonstrated clear motive and showed the extensive premeditation involved in David's scheme. But perhaps most damaging to David's case was his own arrogance. During police questioning, he continued to underestimate the intelligence of the woman he'd tried to kill. His attorney advised him to remain silent, but David couldn't resist trying to explain how I'd misunderstood his intentions, how the recordings were taken out of context, how I was too emotional and naive to accurately interpret what I'd discovered. Every word he spoke provided prosecutors with additional evidence of his guilt and his complete lack of remorse. The trial became a local sensation, covered extensively by Riverside's newspaper and television stations. The story of a husband who'd planned his wife's murder for insurance money, only to be caught by his intended victim's superior planning, captured public attention in ways that made David's conviction virtually certain. Jury selection took longer than usual because so many potential jurors had already formed opinions about the case based on media coverage. During the trial, I testified about discovering David's planning files and described the terror of realizing my husband wanted me dead. But I also testified about my own investigation, my strategic planning, and my decision to fight back rather than simply flee. The prosecution presented me not just as a victim who'd narrowly escaped murder, but as a woman who'd outsmarted a man who'd underestimated her capabilities. David's defense attorney tried to portray him as someone who'd made poor decisions under financial stress, arguing that he'd never actually intended to go through with the murder plan. But the recordings of his conversations with MR made this defense impossible to maintain. David's voice, captured clearly on restaurant audio, discussing specific methods for killing me and disposing of my body, left no room for interpretation about his intentions. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and multiple financial crimes related to his hidden assets and fraudulent policies. The judge sentenced David to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. MR received a shorter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but would still spend the next decade behind bars for his role in the conspiracy. But my victory went beyond David's conviction. The investigation into his finances revealed the full extent of his hidden assets and fraudulent financial planning. Court orders froze his accounts and forced the liquidation of investments he'd tried to hide from me. When the legal dust settled, I received not just half of our legitimate marital assets, but also damages for the emotional distress and attempted murder, plus David's share of assets as compensation for his crimes. The final irony was perfect. David had planned to profit from my death by collecting nearly $2 million in life insurance payouts and gaining complete control of our assets. Instead, his attempt to murder me resulted in my gaining complete control of our assets while he lost his freedom, his reputation, and any possibility of benefiting from his years of criminal planning. 6 months after David's sentencing, I stood in the living room of my new house across town, surrounded by boxes as I prepared for the final step in reclaiming my life. The moving truck was scheduled to arrive that afternoon to transport the, last of my belongings from the house David and I had shared. But first, I had one final task to complete. I'd saved David's laptop for last, the computer that contained all his planning for my murder. Detective Santos had returned it to me after the trial, since it was no longer needed as evidence. I could have thrown it away or donated it, but I wanted something more symbolic. I wanted to destroy the tools David had used to plan my death, in a way that felt appropriate to everything he'd put me through. The fireplace in my new house was beautiful, with a stone hearth and a chimney that drew perfectly. I'd tested it the week before, enjoying the warmth and comfort of flames that represented my new beginning rather than the destruction David had planned for me. Now I fed David's laptop into those flames page by page, watching his spreadsheets and calculations and murder planning documents turn to ash. As the last remnants of David's digital conspiracy dissolved into smoke, I thought about the woman I'd been when this nightmare began and the woman I'd become by fighting back. The trusting wife who'd accepted her husband's explanations without question was gone forever. In her place was someone who investigated, questioned, planned, and took action to protect herself. Someone who'd proven that being underestimated could be the greatest advantage possible. Amy Rodriguez had become one of my closest friends, bonding over our shared experience of recognizing and fighting domestic violence. She'd finished nursing school with my financial help, since her testimony and evidence gathering had been crucial to David's conviction. We met regularly for coffee, sharing stories about building new lives free from the men who'd tried to control or harm us. Patricia Williams had become more than just my attorney. She'd become a mentor in understanding how to navigate complex legal and financial situations. Her guidance had been instrumental not just in David's prosecution, but in helping me rebuild my life with stronger protections and clearer boundaries. She'd taught me that being prepared for the worst didn't mean living in fear, but rather living with confidence that I could handle whatever challenges might arise. Karen Foster had helped me invest the money I'd received from David's conviction, an asset forfeiture in ways that would provide long-term security and independence. More importantly, she'd taught me to understand and control my own financial situation completely, ensuring I'd never again be vulnerable to someone else's hidden planning or manipulation. But the most important thing I'd gained wasn't money, or legal victory, or even safety. It was the knowledge that I was far stronger and more capable than I'd ever realized. David had seen me as a victim waiting to be exploited, someone too trusting and naive to fight back against his schemes. His complete misunderstanding of who I was had been the foundation of his downfall and the source of my triumph. The woman David had married might have been vulnerable to his manipulation and planning. But the woman who discovered his murder plot and systematically destroyed his life in response was someone entirely different. Someone who'd learned that the most dangerous opponent is the one who's underestimated, who appears helpless while actually being prepared, who seems naive while actually being 10 steps ahead. As I watched the last flames consume the last evidence of David's planning, I realized that his greatest crime wasn't trying to kill me for money. It was failing to see who I really was, failing to understand that the woman he'd married had grown into someone capable of anything necessary to protect herself. David Thompson had spent 2 years planning to profit from my death, but in the end, his attempted murder had become the foundation for my new life. And unlike his plans, mine had actually worked. The phone call that changed everything came 3 months after David's sentencing, just as I was beginning to believe the worst was behind me. I was in my new kitchen, preparing dinner and enjoying the peaceful silence of a home where I felt truly safe, when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was nervous, hesitant, but the words she spoke made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Rebecca Martinez from the Thompson Insurance Group. I used to work with your husband before his arrest. There's something you need to know about David's business that didn't come out during the trial. Something that affects a lot more people than just you." Rebecca's voice trembled as she explained that she'd been David's administrative assistant at the insurance company for the past year. During the investigation and trial, she'd kept quiet about certain irregularities she'd noticed in David's client files, partly out of fear and partly because she hadn't understood their significance. But recent events at the office had convinced her that David's criminal activities went far beyond planning my murder. I agreed to meet Rebecca that evening at a small cafe downtown, far from the Thompson Insurance Group offices where she still worked. When she arrived, she looked exhausted and frightened, constantly glancing around as if she expected to be followed. The folder she carried was thick with documents that she handled like they contained explosive materials, which, in a sense, they did. What Rebecca revealed over the next 2 hours fundamentally changed my understanding of who David had been and what he'd been doing during our marriage. The insurance policies on my life weren't an isolated scheme motivated by personal financial gain. They were part of a much larger pattern of fraudulent insurance practices that David had been orchestrating for years, involving dozens of clients and potentially millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. According to Rebecca's documents, David had been systematically encouraging clients to increase their life insurance coverage while simultaneously gathering detailed personal information about their health, habits, and vulnerabilities. The same kind of information he'd been collecting about me. But unlike my situation, where David planned to commit murder himself, these other cases involved something even more sinister. David had been identifying clients whose deaths could appear accidental, then positioning himself to benefit financially when those deaths occurred. Rebecca showed me files on at least 15 clients who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past 3 years. All had been David's personal clients. All had significantly increased their life insurance coverage in the months before their deaths. All had died in ways that appeared accidental, but followed patterns that Rebecca had begun to recognize only after David's arrest made her look at his practices with suspicious eyes. The most disturbing case involved a young couple, Mark and Jennifer Chen, who had been David's clients for 2 years. David had convinced them to increase their coverage substantially after Jennifer became pregnant, arguing that new parents needed additional financial protection. 6 months later, both Mark and Jennifer died in a car accident on a remote mountain road during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway. Their deaths had been ruled accidental, but Rebecca's files showed that David had been unusually interested in their travel plans and had even recommended the specific resort where they'd been headed. Another case involved an elderly man named Robert Hayes who had increased his life insurance at David's suggestion after being diagnosed with early-stage diabetes. Robert died 3 months later from what appeared to be a diabetic emergency while hiking alone. The death was ruled natural causes, but Rebecca's documentation showed that David had been asking detailed questions about Robert's medication schedule and exercise habits in the weeks before his death. Pattern after pattern emerged from Rebecca's files. Clients who trusted David's professional advice about insurance coverage then died under circumstances that appeared accidental but occurred at times and in situations that David had somehow known about in advance. The scope of what David had been doing was staggering, suggesting that my near murder wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of systematic killing disguised as insurance planning. But Rebecca's most shocking revelation was that David hadn't been working alone within the company. His father, Frank Thompson, who owned 30% of the business, had been aware of at least some of David's activities. Rebecca had overheard conversations between father and son about problem clients and natural solutions to coverage issues. She'd initially assumed they were discussing legitimate business challenges, but David's arrest had made her reconsider those conversations in a much darker light. The evidence Rebecca had gathered painted a picture of a family business that had evolved into something resembling an organized crime operation. Frank Thompson's connections in the local business community provided access to wealthy clients, while David's insurance expertise allowed him to identify the most profitable targets. The business had been systematically murdering its own clients for insurance money, using David's professional position to avoid suspicion while generating millions in fraudulent claims. But there was more. Rebecca's investigation had uncovered evidence that Carol Thompson, David's mother, had been involved in gathering personal information about female clients through her extensive social network. Carol's volunteer work with various women's organizations had given her access to personal details about health, relationships, and financial situations that David then used to identify vulnerable targets. The entire Thompson family had been operating a murder-for-profit scheme using their insurance business as a front. The revelation that David's plan to kill me was part of a larger criminal enterprise was both terrifying and oddly validating. I hadn't been targeted because I was a particularly attractive victim, or because David had suddenly developed murderous tendencies. I'd been targeted because I fit the profile of clients the Thompson family had been systematically killing for years. The personal betrayal of David's plan was horrifying enough, but knowing that he'd probably murdered dozens of other people made the situation feel even more urgent. Rebecca explained that she'd been documenting these patterns for weeks, trying to decide what to do with the information. She was terrified of the Thompson family's potential for violence, especially after learning that David had been planning to murder his own wife. But she was also haunted by the possibility that more people would die if the larger conspiracy wasn't exposed. Her decision to contact me had been motivated by the hope that someone who'd already fought David successfully might know how to stop the rest of his family. I told Rebecca about Detective Santos and the domestic violence unit that had handled David's case, suggesting that law enforcement needed to know about the broader conspiracy immediately. But Rebecca was reluctant to contact police directly, fearing that her continued employment at Thompson Insurance Group would make her a target. If the family realized she was cooperating with authorities, she needed protection and a carefully planned approach that would expose the conspiracy without putting her in immediate danger. We spent the rest of the evening developing a strategy that would protect Rebecca while ensuring that law enforcement received the evidence she'd gathered. I would contact Detective Santos and arrange for Rebecca to provide information through official channels that would protect her identity initially. Meanwhile, Rebecca would continue documenting activities at the insurance office while being extremely careful not to arouse suspicion about her investigation. But I realized that stopping the Thompson family's criminal enterprise would require more than just turning over evidence to police. David's conviction had proven that they were capable of sophisticated planning and had been operating undetected for years. Frank and Carol Thompson were still free, still running their business, and potentially still targeting victims. If they suspected that their larger conspiracy was being investigated, they might flee or destroy evidence before justice could be served. The next morning, I contacted Patricia Williams and Detective Santos, arranging an emergency meeting to discuss Rebecca's revelations. Both professionals were stunned by the scope of what Rebecca had uncovered, but agreed that the evidence warranted immediate investigation. Detective Santos began coordinating with the FBI's white-collar crime unit, since the conspiracy potentially crossed state lines and involved federal insurance regulations. But the investigation would take time, and Rebecca was reporting increasingly suspicious behavior at the Thompson Insurance Group offices. Frank Thompson had been asking detailed questions about which files Rebecca had access to and whether she'd noticed anything unusual in David's client records. Carol Thompson had been making unexpected visits to the office, claiming to help with administrative tasks, but actually going through filing cabinets and computer records. The Thompson family was clearly conducting their own investigation, trying to determine whether David's arrest had exposed their larger criminal activities. Rebecca was walking a dangerous line, trying to appear normal and unsuspicious while secretly gathering evidence that could send the entire family to prison. Every day she continued working at Thompson Insurance Group increased the risk that Frank or Carol would realize she knew about their conspiracy. The breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered that Frank Thompson had been using company resources to research my background and current activities. Despite David being in prison and unable to threaten me directly, his father was apparently planning to complete what David had started. Frank had obtained my new address, my work schedule, and detailed information about my daily routines. He'd even researched the route I took to visit Amy Rodriguez, suggesting that my friend might also be considered a threat to their family's secret. This discovery made the situation immediately urgent. The Thompson family wasn't just trying to cover up their past crimes, they were actively planning new ones. Frank Thompson apparently believed that eliminating David's surviving victim would somehow protect their family business from further investigation. He was planning to finish David's work, killing me to silence the most visible witness to their criminal conspiracy. Rebecca's evidence showed that Frank had been meeting with the same MR who'd helped David plan my original murder. Despite MR being in prison, Frank had apparently recruited other associates willing to commit murder for money. The Thompson family had extensive connections in Riverside's business community, including relationships with people who operated outside the law. Finding someone willing to kill for insurance money wouldn't be difficult for a family that had been doing exactly that for years. But Frank Thompson had made the same critical mistake his son had made. He'd underestimated the woman he was planning to kill. While he'd been researching my current life and planning my death, I'd been building relationships with law enforcement, legal professionals, and others who could protect me from exactly this kind of threat. David's conviction had taught me that preparation and evidence were the most powerful weapons against people who thought they could manipulate or intimidate me. Detective Santos immediately arranged for protective surveillance while the FBI fast-tracked their investigation into the Thompson family's insurance fraud conspiracy. But I wanted more than just protection. I wanted to help law enforcement build an unshakable case against Frank and Carol Thompson. They'd spent years murdering innocent people for money, and David's conviction had only touched the surface of their criminal enterprise. Working with Rebecca and the FBI, we developed a plan to gather additional evidence while protecting everyone involved from the Thompson family's retaliation. Rebecca would continue her administrative work while wearing a wire to record conversations about the family's criminal activities. I would appear to resume normal activities while actually being protected by undercover agents who could document any attempts on my life. But the most important element of our plan was something the Thompson family would never expect. We were going to use their own methods against them. Just as David had planned to profit from my death, we were going to use Frank and Carol's planning for my murder as evidence to destroy them completely. Every surveillance photo they took, every plan they made, every conversation they had about killing me would become evidence in their prosecution. The Thompson family had built their criminal enterprise on the assumption that they were smarter and more sophisticated than their victims. They'd succeeded for years because they'd targeted people who trusted them, people who never suspected that their insurance agent was actually planning their murder. But I wasn't one of their unsuspecting clients anymore. I was someone who'd already defeated their best planner and was prepared to take down the entire family operation. Frank and Carol Thompson were about to learn the same lesson David had learned in that police station parking lot. The woman they thought they could kill was actually the one who would destroy them. But this time, the stakes were higher and the victory would be more complete. This time, I wasn't just fighting for my own life. I was fighting for justice for all the people the Thompson family had murdered over the years. The final confrontation was coming, and unlike David's clumsy attempt at Pine Lake, this one would end with the complete destruction of a criminal enterprise that had operated in Riverside for far too long. The Thompson family had underestimated me once before, leading to David's conviction and imprisonment. They were about to make that same mistake again, but this time the consequences would reach much further than one man's failed murder plot. As I prepared for what would be the final battle in my war against the Thompson family, I realized that David's attempt to kill me had actually been the beginning of something much larger. His arrest had exposed a conspiracy that might have continued indefinitely if he'd succeeded in murdering me at Pine Lake. Instead, his failure had become the first step toward justice for dozens of victims and the end of a family business built on systematic murder. The woman David had tried to kill was about to become the instrument of his entire family's downfall. And this time, there would be no escape, no reduced sentences, No possibility that any member of the Thompson family would ever again be free to profit from someone else's death. The warehouse on Industrial Boulevard looked abandoned from the outside, its faded brick facade and broken windows suggesting another casualty of Riverside's economic downturn. But according to the FBI surveillance team, it served as Frank Thompson's meeting place for business that couldn't be conducted at the family insurance office. Tonight, he would be gathering with his associates to finalize plans for my elimination, unaware that every word would be recorded and every participant identified. Agent Sarah Chen had been leading the federal investigation into the Thompson insurance conspiracy for 3 weeks, ever since Rebecca's evidence had revealed the scope of their criminal enterprise. The FBI had moved quickly but carefully, building a comprehensive case that would ensure all family members faced appropriate charges. Tonight's operation would be the culmination of their investigation, designed to capture Frank Thompson and his associates in the act of planning murder, while simultaneously protecting me from any actual harm. I sat in an unmarked van 2 blocks away, monitoring the surveillance feeds that showed Frank arriving at the warehouse precisely at 9 o'clock. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed his activities were undetected, carrying a briefcase that likely contained photos of me, maps of my daily routes, and payment for whoever would carry out his plan. The irony wasn't lost on me that Frank was walking into the same kind of trap his son had fallen into at Giovanni's restaurant. Agent Chen's voice crackled through the communication system as she coordinated the positioning of agents around the warehouse perimeter. The operation required precise timing to ensure they captured evidence of conspiracy without allowing any participant to escape or destroy documentation. But unlike David's amateur planning with MR, Frank's organization was more sophisticated, involving multiple participants and contingency plans that made this arrest more complex. Through the surveillance equipment, I watched as 3 other men joined Frank inside the warehouse. Rebecca's intelligence had identified 2 of them as associates with criminal backgrounds who'd been involved in previous Thompson family operations. The 3rd man was someone I didn't recognize, but his presence suggested that Frank was expanding his network to handle what he considered an urgent problem, silencing the woman who'd destroyed his son's life. The conversation that followed, captured clearly by FBI recording equipment, was everything Agent Chen needed to complete her case against the Thompson family conspiracy. Frank outlined his plan to eliminate me with the same clinical detachment David had used when discussing my murder with MR. But Frank's approach was more systematic, involving multiple backup plans and coordination with family members who would provide alibis and financial support. What emerged from Frank's planning session was confirmation that the Thompson family had been operating their murder-for-profit scheme for over 5 years. They'd killed at least 23 people, collecting millions in fraudulent insurance claims while maintaining the facade of a respectable family business. Each murder had been carefully planned to appear accidental, with family members playing specific roles in targeting victims, gathering intelligence, and ensuring successful claim processing. But Frank's conversation also revealed something that made my blood boil. Carol Thompson had been the mastermind behind much of the operation. While David and Frank handled the practical aspects of insurance fraud and murder planning, Carol had been responsible for identifying and researching potential victims through her extensive social connections. She'd used her volunteer work and community involvement to gather personal information about wealthy women, then passed that intelligence to her husband and son for evaluation as potential targets. The recording captured Frank describing how Carol had already identified my replacement as a target, a recently widowed woman named Margaret Foster, who'd inherited substantial assets and was considering increasing her life insurance coverage. Carol had befriended Margaret through a grief support group, positioning herself to influence Margaret's financial decisions while gathering information about her vulnerabilities. If Frank succeeded in killing me, Margaret would likely be their next victim. Agent Chen signaled that they had enough evidence to proceed with arrests, but I requested permission to make one final contribution to the case. The FBI had agreed to let me participate in tonight's operation as a way of gathering additional evidence, and I wanted to ensure that Frank Thompson understood exactly how completely his family's conspiracy had been exposed. Just as I'd confronted David in the police station parking lot, I wanted Frank to know that his intended victim had orchestrated his downfall. The warehouse door burst open as FBI agents moved in to arrest Frank and his associates. The men scattered initially, but the building had been surrounded and there was no possibility of escape. Within minutes, all 4 conspirators were in custody, their planning documents seized as evidence, and their communications equipment confiscated for analysis. Frank Thompson's expression when he saw Agent Chen reading him his rights was a mixture of shock and calculation, as if he was still trying to figure out how his careful planning had been discovered. But his expression changed completely when I walked into the warehouse behind the FBI agents. Frank's eyes widened as he realized that his intended victim wasn't just alive and protected, but had actually been instrumental in exposing his conspiracy. The woman he'd planned to murder had become the primary architect of his arrest, just as his son had discovered months earlier. The Thompson family's consistent underestimation of my capabilities was about to cost them everything. I approached Frank directly, flanked by Agent Chen and Detective Santos, who'd been coordinating with the federal investigation. Frank's associates had been loaded into separate vehicles, but the FBI had agreed to let me speak with Frank before his transport to ensure he understood the full scope of what had been uncovered. I wanted him to know that his family's years of murdering innocent people were finally over. The conversation was brief, but satisfying. I told Frank about Rebecca's cooperation and the evidence she'd provided about the Thompson family's systematic killing of insurance clients. I explained how the FBI had been monitoring his activities for weeks, documenting his research into my current life and his recruitment of new associates to carry out my murder. Most importantly, I wanted him to understand that his arrest was just the beginning of justice for his family's victims. Frank's reaction was exactly what I'd expected from David's father. He tried to maintain his innocence, claiming that any evidence against him had been misinterpreted or fabricated. He suggested that David had been operating independently, without family knowledge or support. He even attempted to portray himself as another victim of his son's criminal behavior, someone who'd been trying to salvage the family business reputation after David's conviction. But Frank's denials became irrelevant when Agent Chen informed him that Carol Thompson was being arrested simultaneously at their family home. A search warrant executed that evening had uncovered extensive documentation of the insurance conspiracy, including Carol's files on potential victims and correspondence with David about specific murder plans. The evidence found at the Thompson residence would prove that the entire family had been involved in systematic murder for years. The arrests that night effectively ended the Thompson insurance conspiracy, but the legal proceedings that followed revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Over the next 6 months, federal prosecutors built cases against Frank and Carol Thompson that demonstrated their leadership of an organized murder scheme spanning multiple states and involving dozens of victims. Rebecca's testimony and the evidence she'd gathered proved crucial in establishing the systematic nature of their operations. But the most damaging evidence came from David himself. Faced with additional charges related to the broader conspiracy, David agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. His detailed confession about the family's operations provided prosecutors with information about murders that had never been investigated, victims whose deaths had been accepted as accidental without question. David's cooperation revealed that the Thompson family had been even more prolific than Rebecca's initial investigation had suggested. They'd been responsible for at least 37 murders over 5 years, targeting insurance clients across 3 states, and collecting over $8 million in fraudulent claims. Each murder had been carefully planned and executed to avoid suspicion, with family members playing coordinated roles in identifying victims, gathering intelligence, and ensuring successful claim processing. The trial of Frank and Carol Thompson became one of the largest insurance fraud prosecutions in federal history. The evidence presented during the proceedings shocked the Riverside community and drew national media attention to what prosecutors described as a family business built entirely on systematic murder. The Thompson Insurance Group was permanently shut down, its assets seized to provide restitution for victims' families. Carol Thompson's conviction was particularly satisfying for me personally. Her use of community volunteer work and social connections to identify and research murder victims represented a level of betrayal that went beyond simple criminal behavior. She'd exploited the trust of women seeking support and friendship, turning their vulnerabilities into death sentences for financial profit. Her sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole felt appropriate given the scope of her crimes. Frank Thompson received the same sentence, with federal prosecutors successfully arguing that his leadership of the conspiracy warranted the harshest possible punishment. The judge's sentencing statement specifically noted that Frank had shown no remorse for his crimes and had continued planning murders even after his son's arrest demonstrated the family's exposure to law enforcement scrutiny. But my greatest satisfaction came from knowing that the Thompson family's conspiracy had been completely dismantled. David remained in state prison serving his original sentence for attempting to murder me. Frank and Carol would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison for their leadership of the insurance fraud conspiracy. Ryan Thompson, David's brother, had been cleared of involvement in the criminal activities, but faced civil litigation that would bankrupt him financially. The investigation's conclusion also brought closure for families of the Thompson conspiracy's victims. Many had accepted their loved ones' deaths as accidents, never suspecting murder. Federal prosecutors worked with victim services organizations to provide support and counseling for families, learning that their losses had actually been calculated murders designed to generate insurance profits. Margaret Foster, the woman Carol had been targeting as their next victim, became a close friend after learning how narrowly she'd escaped death. Her gratitude for my role in stopping the conspiracy before she became another victim created a bond between us that reminded me daily of why fighting back had been so important. The Thompson family's plan to kill me would have led directly to Margaret's murder if their conspiracy hadn't been exposed. 6 months after the final Thompson family convictions, I found myself standing in the cemetery where many of their victims had been buried. The headstones bore names of people I'd never met, but felt connected to through our shared experience of being targeted by the same criminal family. Robert Hayes, Mark and Jennifer Chen, and dozens of others whose deaths had been dismissed as accidents until David's arrest revealed the truth. I placed flowers at several graves, honoring people whose murders had gone undetected until my own near-death experience exposed the conspiracy that killed them. Their families deserved to know the truth about how their loved ones died, and their deaths deserved to be recognized as murders rather than accidents. The Thompson family's conviction had finally provided that recognition and justice. But the cemetery visit also represented something personal for me. The woman who'd discovered David's murder planning on his laptop 8 months earlier had been someone who'd lived her life reacting to other people's decisions and plans. The woman standing among those graves was someone who'd learned to take control of her own destiny and protect others from the kind of evil she'd survived. The Thompson family had targeted me because they saw someone they could manipulate and kill without consequence. They'd calculated my death the same way they'd calculated dozens of others, reducing human lives to financial equations and profit margins. But their fundamental miscalculation had been assuming that their intended victim would remain passive and helpless in the face of their planning. Instead, I'd become the instrument of their complete destruction. David's attempted murder had led to his conviction and imprisonment. Frank's plan to finish what David started had resulted in federal prosecution and life sentences for both parents. Carol's systematic targeting of vulnerable women had been exposed and stopped permanently. The Thompson Insurance Group's criminal enterprise had been dismantled entirely. As I walked back to my car that afternoon, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since discovering David's spreadsheets calculating my death's value. The terrorized wife who'd sat in that home office staring at her husband's murder plans was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd proven that being underestimated could be turned into the greatest possible advantage. The Thompson family had spent years believing they were smarter and more sophisticated than their victims. They'd succeeded in murdering dozens of people because they'd targeted individuals who trusted them and never suspected their true intentions. But when they chose to target someone who fought back with intelligence, preparation, and determination, their entire criminal enterprise collapsed. I drove home that evening to a house I'd chosen and purchased with money I'd earned independently, in a neighborhood where I felt safe and valued. My life was entirely my own now, free from manipulation or control by people who saw me as a commodity to be exploited. David had planned to profit from my death, but instead, his failure had become the foundation for my complete independence and empowerment. The final irony was perfect. The Thompson family had spent years calculating how much money they could make from other people's deaths. In the end, their attempt to profit from my murder had cost them everything: their freedom, their assets, their reputation, and their future. They'd gambled everything on their ability to kill one more victim, and they'd lost completely to the woman they'd most underestimated. David Thompson had opened his laptop one morning and created spreadsheets calculating how much money my death would bring him. I'd closed that laptop and created a plan that brought him and his entire family to justice instead. The woman he'd tried to reduce to dollar signs and actuarial tables had proven to be worth far more than he'd ever calculated, just not in the way he'd intended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.